Hey you guys, it's Peter, and welcome to my channel, Peter Watches TV, where I watch all the TV shows, and then I come over here and I talk about them. And today I want to talk about a documentary that just came out on Netflix, and I just watched it last night. I had seen something about it about a month ago that it was coming out, and I was kind of blown away, in all honesty. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. There's a whole documentary about Venus Xtravaganza. And so I was really excited about it, and then I kind of forgot that it was coming out. So I was going into Netflix last night to finish watching The Waterfront, which I had started watching this weekend, and I saw that it had just been released. This new documentary that just came out, which is called I Am Venus. It's called I'm Your Venus, and it is about Venus Xtravaganza, who the world was first introduced to in a documentary that came out in 1990 called Paris is Burning. And I was like, I am watching this tonight. I'm going to watch this tonight, and I was so excited to watch it. So to give a little backstory to all of this, there was a documentary that came out in 1990, and it was called Paris is Burning. And it is about the ballroom culture in New York City. And I can remember when the documentary came out, because I came out in 1990, and I came out into a world of hanging out with drag queens, many of which were trans women. And I can remember talking about the documentary. I mean, we had all seen it. Everybody had seen Paris is Burning that I knew at that time. And I can remember talking to some of my friends, many of which were trans women, that for the first time felt really, really seen. I'm somebody that believes in books and pop culture, television shows, movies. I think that own voices for whatever marginalized community you identify with, I think it's really, really important. And so, I believe in, reading books from gay authors for me, and things like that is really, really important. And when I was growing up, there wasn't a lot of that. There wasn't, I've shared this story in my vlog. For those of you that do not know, I vlog every single day. It's just, I sit on my front porch and drink coffee and just kind of talk for like an hour to an hour and a half and just kind of tell stories of my life. But I can remember being like in middle school and having all these feelings inside of me and not really, knowing what to do with these feelings or understanding what these feelings were. And I can remember going to like B. Dalton bookstores and Walden bookstores, which don't even exist today. And there would be, a section that was somewhere between like the self-help and self-help and true crime probably, and it was a section about this big, and it was their gay section and it would be like, I can remember like the gay section, which was just, male stuff. And there would be like one book that was, from long ago. And then it was on like the joy of gay sex, the Kama Sutra of gay sex. And I can remember standing there at like 13, 14 years old and feeling very dirty and feeling very wrong in my own skin, that the only identification that I could find in a bookstore, and I love to read, I've always loved to read, the only identification that I could find was this idea that whatever these feelings were inside of me were sexualized and dirty, at a point when I didn't even really understand what that was. And so, to then later, today, flash forward 30 some years later, there's tons of books, with LGBTQI plus characters, there's tons of movies, there's tons of documentaries, there's TV shows. We've gone from Paris is Burning in 1990 to Legendary being on HBO Max, which is a reality competition show about the ballroom culture, to RuPaul's Drag Race, which is a phenomenon of itself about drag queens. And so to think that we've come so far, right? But I think we really still live in very, very scary times, especially, I would say, just in the last couple of years, especially when it comes to trans rights. And so this documentary coming out right now is really, really important, because I can remember when Paris is Burning came out in 1990. And I wasn't part of the ballroom culture. I had gone to some, but it wasn't a big deal in Indianapolis, Indiana, where I grew up. And I, knew a little bit about it. But it wasn't just about that. It was about LGBTQI plus representation being seen on a big screen and identifying it and being like, oh wow, like I see my story and other people's stories out there. And it was huge. It was a huge deal. I don't even know that I can explain what that feeling was like, seeing people talking about reading and throwing shade and, and all that kind of stuff, which were things that my community, we were all talking about in kind of a slang kind of way. And just the idea of, families of origin, which are biological families versus family of choice. And in ballroom culture, family of choice is seen many times within the houses. And it was just such an important documentary to come out at that time, because it really made us, I think many of us, feel seen. It made me feel seen. And Venus Xtravaganza was at the House of Xtravaganza, and so she was one of the main people that was part of this documentary that came out in 1990. And years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, for my other channel, my Peter Mon channel, I wanted to do kind of like Where Are They Now? On the Paris is Burning cast, because, I can't even tell you, I've probably seen the documentary, no exaggeration, probably at least 60 times in my life. I know so many of the lines. I know a lot of the history of it, that there was a lot of complaints afterwards because the people that were cast in the show, they didn't get paid a lot. I watched the other documentary that was done shortly after, with a lot of the people that were in Paris is Burning. And so I kind of kept up with it through the years. And I knew that many of the people that were in Paris is Burning had passed away. But I didn't know that almost everybody that was in Paris is Burning had passed away. If you watch Paris is Burning, at the end of the documentary, they explain that that Venus had been murdered before, like, the documentary had even been finished. And so I knew that she had been murdered, and it had been like this kind of unsolved murder. Now, the scary thing about it is that even in 1990, I remember when that documentary came out, I knew trans women that had been attacked on the streets. I knew trans women that had been violently acted towards. And so, to be honest with you, I don't know that part was so surprising, which is really scary. That the LGBTQI+ community had kind of just become almost, I don't want to say immune, but we were used to violence towards our community. And so I wasn't really that surprised about it. And I also wasn't so surprised that it was a case that police weren't heavily looking into. I had a friend of mine that was shot taking some people home, and they didn't really look into that very deeply. I had another friend of mine that was a lesbian that was beat up in an alley right beside a gay bar. And, the police weren't that interested in worrying about what had happened to her. This was also the time, and I've talked a lot about this on my other channel as well, and I've done reactions to the documentaries over here, but this was the time that Herb Baumeister was in Indianapolis, and there was a serial killer that was hunting gay men, and the police were rather indifferent to it. And so I grew up in a community that was coming right out of the AIDS crisis, which much of Paris is Burning is part of, like, the AIDS crisis, is where the house is and all that kind of stuff. Were a huge part of that period of time. And so for me, I came out of that into this world of, like, always, like, watch your back, always tell people where you're going, things like that. So the story of Venus has always intrigued me for many reasons. First of all, as somebody that is part of the LGBTQI+ community, as somebody that is a believer in the fighting for trans rights, as somebody that came out at the time that Paris is Burning came out with, so for me there's some identification with the people that were in that show, although our stories are very, very different. I'm also a lover of true crime, and so that it was a case that had never been solved, and as far as I knew, and I had looked into it and Google searched it, it was a closed case. They weren't looking into it anymore. So when I saw that this documentary came out, I thought, this is really, really, number one, before I even started watching it, I was like, this is a really important documentary in the times that we're living in today. I think it's a really important documentary, and the way that it was done there were some very, very uncomfortable scenes, and it was done in such a fantastic way. I was just super, super impressed with this documentary. So I wanted to kind of give you my background of why I was so interested in Paris is Burning and why I wanted to watch this documentary called I'm Your Venus. And so I just was just blown away that there was an entire documentary. To think about, I can remember seeing it for the first time, and they show a lot of clips of her at her grandmother's apartment when she's, like, in the bed and she's talking about what she wants her life to be like. And I can remember watching it at that time, and then you find out, I think maybe the first time I watched it, like, some friends of mine had told me that she was, like, when she came on the screen, they were like, oh, she got murdered, that you'll find that out at the end. And so I think I can remember knowing that, and to think that this life cut short, that all these years later, that this young girl, this, young woman walking in balls in New York City that was just hoping someday to be like this fashion model is impacting such change in the world. I think it's a huge thing. I think it's a really, really huge thing, you know? And I think it goes to the power of that all of our stories are important and that all of our stories can impact at least maybe one person's life out there. And that's really a lot of what this is about. So anyway, it starts off, and if you haven't watched it yet, I would highly recommend it. It's not a documentary like, I'm going to go through, I'm going to tell you some of the things that happened and what stood out to me, but it's not a kind of documentary that if I told you everything, it's going to ruin it for you. I mean, it's not a ruining documentary. It's, I mean, if you look, Google search anything, you'll know that the case of Venus Xtravaganza is still an open case to this day, that they have not solved it. It's not one of those kinds of things. It's not something that I could tell you something and you'd be like, oh, well, Peter just ruined it for me. It's not that kind of documentary at all. It's more of kind of like a character study of who Venus was, her family, her biological family, her house family, and what happened to her. So when it starts with her one brother. And so she's got 3 brothers. And they do a lot of family history of how she grew up and things like that. They talk a lot about her brothers and whatever. And, her one brother says, and I think this is why it's so important in the time that we live in today. He says at the beginning of it, he wishes that he had a crystal ball and he could go back in time and see how things would end up because he would do things so differently. And I think it's a really poignant statement, and, you know, especially like I said, in the times that we live in today, because we don't have that opportunity, right? We don't have the opportunity. So when we're interacting with people today, when we're interacting with friends or family, and we don't understand where they're coming from, we do have the opportunity to ask those questions. We do have the opportunity to get to know somebody better on a human level. Many times we don't, 20 years later, have a crystal ball to be able, you know, to look back and say, I wish I would have done things differently. But in today's, you know, like in present, we do. And so I think that their story is so important for people living their experience today. I think it's a really important story for people that are living through it today. And so the brother goes on and talks about all of them growing up together. And I put on here in my notes, it's such an important documentary for people to see because you can see a family and how they looked and how they felt at the time that Venus came out as trans and what their response to that was, and that they were confused and they didn't understand a lot of it. And then it goes in and starts talking about how her brothers want to look into finding out what happened to her. And then it focuses on Giselle Xtravaganza, who is the house mother of the House of Xtravaganza today. And so she starts working with her brothers and trying to find out what happened to Venus. And her brothers are talking about the fact that for all these years, there's been this perception that her biological family didn't care what had happened to Venus. I will say this, I thought it was really, like, from the get-go, I mean, these are, like, tough New York guys, and, like, from the get-go, they are, like, as far as, like, the words they use, the way they describe Venus is all very respectful. They even talk about dead naming in this documentary, which I think is really important that they talk about that. And they even, like, I mean, it's even not just talking about it, it's like putting action to their words. And so, and I was kind of impressed with that right from the beginning. But they talk about how there was this perception that the family didn't care about her. Now, I will say this. It is made very, very clear that the brothers, how they felt at the time, and at the time that Venus was coming out as trans, that they weren't probably using correct pronouns. They probably weren't as respectful as they are today. And they even say something at some point that sometimes really bad things have to happen for you to get to a point where you learn something. And I think that's a sad state that we live in this world today, that we're like, we have to lose people that we love to learn a lesson. Like, I hope that does, I hope maybe this documentary can exist so that one person doesn't have to lose somebody, so they can learn, you know, a different way. Also, Venus's niece is a huge part of this documentary, and you kind of get the feeling, like, she's not really that highlighted in the documentary, but you kind of get the feeling that she's kind of the driving force a little bit behind a lot of the brothers, like putting all the work together and stuff like that. And then her brother is talking about her dead name on her tombstone. This is like a huge part of the documentary, and which they're trying to change. It's this part where he brings out her public library card that she got, like, right before she was murdered. And so she was murdered in, I believe, 1988 is when she was murdered. And they found her strangled in a hotel room. If you watch the documentary Paris is Burning, she goes in there and she explains basically that she's, like, escorting. And And so she talks a lot. I mean, that's one of the things that, like, well, that's for a whole other video. But anyway, I think if you watch a documentary, you understand probably that's probably what happened to her. And I think that's why a lot of times trans women that are forced into only having the position, you know, I was watching some of their documentary, I can't remember what it was, but it was where they like had taken, it was the, oh, what's it called in New York City? I'm gonna get this so wrong, but it was like the meatpacking district, which was where like a lot of the trans prostitutes worked. And they had like redone that entire area. And so it was these trans prostitutes that went back and they were like, well, this is what this was. And it was called like The Stroll or something like that on HBO. It was fantastically done. And so anyway, but what was interesting about it was that the producer asked one of the women in they said, well, why were you forced into sex work? And she said, well, it wasn't like they were going to hire me as a trans woman down at the shoe store, you know, or the CVS. She was like, there was nowhere for us to work. She was like, so we were forced into a position of sex work, which is really sad when you think about that, right? And then you think also about the fact that one of the reasons why I think the reputation of trans women in our world today is so frowned upon or looked down upon is because so many of them in the past have been sex workers, but were forced into that position because they had no other options to take care of themselves. And so, you know, you look at that whole situation and then it's like, well, maybe Venus was, people weren't looking into her as closely because it was probably a murder because she was a sex worker. Well, that was the only way that she could take care of herself financially, you know, at that time. And so, and I can remember having conversations with my friends at that time. So they found her in this hotel room and she had been strangled to death is what had happened to her. So they're looking into it. But before that, her brother's talking about how she got this library card and it has her dead name on it. And they like don't show the dead name or anything, which I thought was extremely respectful. And so they're trying to get her, a lot of the documentary is about her, them getting her legal name changed to Venus with her biological last name, which I think is Pellegrati or something like that, and then Xtravaganza. And that would be really, really important to her. The brother on when he's showing the library card says she hated her dead name. And so they talk a lot about the dead names in there. And then they start initiating this litigation in New Jersey. The problem is that they would be the very, very first case in New Jersey ever to, after somebody's death, change their legal name. And so it's a huge deal. They call it, the attorney calls it impact litigation because it's the first time that it would ever happen in New Jersey. And so it's setting precedent. It's setting precedent in a way. And this is a really important documentary for this reason alone, in the times that we live in right now, that this just happened. I think the video was filmed, or the documentary was filmed in 2022 and 2023. So I think it's really important that when we feel like we're taking 10 steps back sometimes, that we watch a documentary like this and it reminds us there are some positive things that are continuing to happen. And with as many negative things that are happening, there are a few positive things that are happening out here. So then the brother talks about her dead name on her tombstone and how the brothers want to get that changed as well. So then they have this really hard conversation. They go into some like trans rights organization and this woman sets up their meeting with somebody that was like her house, I think, uncle and brother as well, and in the house of Xtravaganza. And he explains to them, it was such a powerful conversation. I think it's a conversation that I like. You don't see conversations like this in documentaries a lot. But he explains that a lot of the people that were part of the House of Xtravaganza were people that had like basically like childhood wounds and trauma, and they were scarred in some way. And he said, and Venus was one of those people. And you can tell the brothers have a really hard time hearing this. They're like, well, we loved Venus and whatever. And he doesn't ever really back down. He's like, I'm not saying that you didn't love her, but she didn't feel respected by you. And it's a really, really important conversation, I think, for anybody to see. And not just because if you know somebody in the LGBTQI plus community, but in anybody in any kind of oppressed or marginalized community that you might know. I think this conversation is so important to say, it's really sometimes important just to see somebody as they are, to validate them, just to validate their human experience. And it's a really, really powerful conversation. And then one brother, you know, he gets very emotional. You find out later that he's been sober for 22 years. He gets a tattoo of Venus, or her name, on his arm. And he says, you know, he says to this guy, he says, I'm not saying that that we didn't do things wrong and that I was confused, because I was confused when, you know, Venus was trans. It was very confusing to me. I didn't understand it. But if I could look back now, and I think this is why the documentary is so important, because we don't have that kind of time, right? We don't have that time. when we're 80 to look back and say, oh, I wish I would have done all these things differently now. This is why this documentary is so important for anybody out there with this kind of lived experience to say, I don't want to look back at 80 or 60. I want to look back. I want to impact some change now with the people that I love in my life. That conversation was just super, super, I thought, important and profound to the whole context of the whole documentary. And you can just see, like, they blame themselves so much, these brothers, because they don't say it, but, I mean, they do kind of, but you really get it, that they weren't extremely accepting of Venus being trans at the time. Time has passed. Paris is Burning has gotten a lot of attention, and I think through the process, I don't think 30 years ago they probably referred to her as she. I don't think they referred to her as her sister. It starts off with the one brother saying my sister. I'm not necessarily sure that that was the case at 30, but I don't know. But you really get the idea that over time they've really, like, changed how they have felt about this whole situation. And I don't blame them for that. You know, as a person in the LGBTQI plus community, I think, you know, one of the things that I learned very, very early on from my mother was that parents and friends have their own coming out process. And I feel blessed that I came out to extremely loving parents and extremely, you know, supportive family and friends of the family and things like that. My school experience was completely different. My peer experience was completely different. It was not loving and accepting. But my family was. That's not the experience of a lot of people. I can remember when I first came out, and I had so many friends of mine whose parents literally disowned them. I know people today that have no relationship with their parents because their parents are like, get the hell out of my house. I mean, it's still happening today. And I think that's why we're seeing today, in today's time, a lot of 40, 50, and 60-year-olds coming out in whatever color of the rainbow. Because I think they have felt like they had to live in the shadows. This is why pride is important. Pride is important because we had to live in the shadows of shame for so long. So that's another reason why I think this documentary coming out during Pride Month is extremely important. But that's another reason why, you know, when people say things like, well, I'm going to have a straight Pride Month, have a straight Pride Month. And explain to me also how you lived in the shadows of shame. How you lived as a straight person feeling like just because you were straight, you were less than somebody else, or you deserved less, or your value or your worth was less. That's why pride is important. It's about being proud of who we are, because for so long we were not. Because other people were telling us we should not be, and we bought into that. We believed it. And even if people weren't telling us, we thought there was something wrong with us. That's why pride is so important. I think it's missed out on people. It's about pride parades and pride. That's the celebration of it all, right? That's the celebration of it all. And if somebody wants to have a straight pride parade, hey, more power to you, do it, okay? But as you're doing it, just realize that we are inundated and have been for 50 years with couples kissing on the street, couples kissing in the restaurants, boy-girl dances in schools that we were brought up in, that we've had to fight for our rights to bring partners to, you know, I mean, we are inundated in heterosexuality in our society. And so for us, I don't know that I necessarily see that there would be a need to have a straight pride, because you've had it your entire life. We haven't. And so that's the reason why pride is so important. And I think that's another reason why this documentary is so important as well. Very, very important documentary. And so they meet with the lawyers to talk about the case. A couple times they meet with some different lawyers in there. And they talk about this guy that was locked up for a different charge, which YouTube doesn't like that word, the R word. And he called the police detective and said that he had killed. It was I think after the documentary came out. He must have probably seen the documentary, because they do DNA testing. It doesn't match him at all. That's why the case is still open. But when the attorney tells him this, two of the brothers are like, let's look at the sunset out the window, and okay, let's just remember her how she was, and like we kind of really know that this is what happened. And the one brother's like, I'm not done with this yet. Like I don't feel like this is conclusive. And the attorney's like, well, then you would have to force the detectives to reopen the case so that they could match the DNA. If it were me, any family member, any friend of mine, I'd be like, they should have fucking reopened the case 30 years ago. It should never have been closed. We have DNA matching now. Open the case. And the two brothers, I mean, I was kind of confused about this part a little bit, because they're the ones behind the documentary, pushing the documentary to talk about the life of Venus Xtravaganza and solve her murder. And then the attorney meets with them and goes, well, we think it might be this guy, but we don't know. And they're like, oh, well, that's good enough for us. And I was kind of like, oh no, baby, if that was one of my friends or family, I'd be like, we're doing this deal. And the one brother, he will not back down. And it kind of surprises me because it's not the brother that I thought it would be. So he's like, no, I want to go forward with it. So they, and you can just tell in this moment, like the brothers are still kind of like blaming themselves so much. The sober brother is like, I cannot continue to do this all the time. Like you can tell they're now living the pain of what happened 30 years ago. And so if the one brother wants to keep it open, so they decided they're going to reopen it to see if they can match the possible suspects. Then her house, the House of Xtravaganza, is trying to make the house. I loved this part so much. This was so cool and it was so important. So throughout Paris is Burning, they show this window where she lives at her grandmother's house, and it's where they film her in the bedroom and stuff like that. So Giselle Xtravaganza, who's the mother of the House of Xtravaganza, and her house decide that they are going to turn it into a landmark. And so they have to go through to like petition council members to make Venus Xtravaganzas. This is just, okay, first of all, let's just think about this for a second, okay? This is a trans woman, I think she was 22 when she passed away, or 23, that was walking in balls in New York City before mainstream media even knew what the ballroom culture was, okay? Had no real idea of, like, I mean, today people are terrified of trans people because, you know, the LGBTQI plus community, I mean, we are impacting so much fear in this world, you know. But 30 years ago, I mean, you talk about this trans woman that was living in this apartment at her grandmother's house, that was walking balls, that wanted to be a model someday, okay, has now been an inspiration to so many trans women by living her truth and being confident, that was murdered. And they are wanting to turn her apartment into a landmark. And they talk about how it's really, really important that the LGBTQI plus community, okay, like Stonewall, the Stonewall Inn and things like that, that we have safe historical places that we can visit so we can see our history. And in that moment, I was like, wow, like I don't hear people talking about this in the LGBTQI plus community at all. Like hardly ever. Like this was such an important part of this documentary. So they're trying to get this apartment landmarked. Then they go in and they get Venus's name changed, and they want to get her tombstone changed. And they talk about, Giselle Xtravaganza talks about her brothers, like, it's really a sign of respect for Venus. It's really not about the name change at this point or the gravestone. I mean, that's all really cool, but it's really more about showing respect for Venus and the way that she wanted to live her life, who she felt she was, and things like that. Then the DNA comes back and it is not a match to the guy that claimed that he murdered Venus. So to this day, the case is not closed. It is still an open investigation. They have no idea who did it. They have the landmark hearing, and the councilman, okay, so it gets approved. The landmark gets approved to be like a historical landmark, which I was like, did this just happen? Like, this is so cool. I didn't even know about this until I watched this documentary. I mean, this is why I think it's so important. Like when I can remember a couple years ago, I started watching all these documentaries, you know, that I just was like, I read so many books about the history of the LGBTQI plus community and about the AIDS crisis. And I thought, you know, Peter, you really need to know your history because history repeats itself sometimes. And we need to know our history. And this is part of my culture as a gay man. I need to know this. And I can remember watching documentaries called like We Were Here, or How to Survive a pandemic. No, it was about the AIDS crisis. I can't remember what it's called. How to Survive. Oh, anyway, it was fantastic. And the Candy Darling documentary. And I didn't even know that like Tennessee Williams had written an entire play just for Candy Darling from the factory, Andy Warhol's factory. And I watched all these documentaries that had to do with people that came way before me, that paved the road for me to be able to be married to my husband today. My husband and I will have been married in August 14 years, and we'll have been together 17 years. And when I was in high school, if somebody had said to me that that would be possible, I could never have imagined it. I could never have imagined that I would be living in a home, you know, with our dogs that have since passed away, and talking to my neighbors and them asking me, oh, what time does Alex get home? That I could never conceptualize that. So all these people that came before us, and all these people that came before me paved the road for where I am today. And that's important. That alone is why her story is important, you know, even though she was just a few years older than me. And it's also important to remember right now, as we're going through these difficult times, that trans women were the first ones that fought for gay men's rights. I think that's something that's sometimes forgotten when we forget our history. That it was the trans women that were out there fighting for gay men's rights that we have today, you know? And I think that's why it's important for me when I do videos on my other channel talking about trans rights and LGBTQI plus rights and stuff, why I always say, we've got your back. Like, I think think that's important, you know, because I think that there's a lot being done out there to divide the LGBTQI plus community. I think in some ways, watching this documentary, it gave me hope that the LGBTQI plus community at times has felt very divided to me. And maybe through these difficult times, I'll tell you one thing. As somebody that came out at the end of the AIDS crisis and has lived through the different, you know, Westboro Baptist Church coming down on us and all this kind of stuff, you know, the camera stopped. I can't believe I'm talking so long, 30 minutes. Anyway, and living through all the different things that have happened to the LGBTQI plus community today, the majority of my life, I have lived without a lot of rights. Marriage equality passed, you know, since I've been with my husband. The majority of my life as an out gay man, I have lived with really no rights. I've lived through the Religious Freedom Act in Indiana where they could deny us service. That was just, you know, 10 years ago. I've lived through so many things that one of the things that I do know is through the AIDS crisis, through all the marriage equality, through all these things that have happened, that the LGBTQI plus community has persevered, and we are still here. And we have made it through these times. And we're going to continue to make it through these times. But I think it's important to see documentaries like this because they remind us of who our history is. And for our straight allies out there, of which I have many, and I am so grateful for my straight allies, I think these documentaries are important to shine a window on something that you don't know anything about. And I think it's also interesting that this documentary is from the point of view of her 3 heterosexual brothers and their experience with having a trans sister. I think for that reason alone, this documentary is just, it's vital. So they have a landmark hearing, and one of the council members, before they vote on it, this man says, I thought this was so powerful. He says, it's important that we are not selective in the diversity that we accept. And I was like, it brought me to tears watching it. I thought, that is such a powerful statement in our times, and any times, to not be selective in the diversity that we accept. That we're okay with this, but we're not okay with that. You know, I thought it was such an important, and coming from a councilman, I thought it was so important. And so then it gets approved, and they're talking about how it's protecting safe spaces for the LGBTQIA plus community. Then at the end of it, her brothers go to, I wonder if they were going to do this. Her brothers go to a ball, and they see what the ball culture is like, which I thought was kind of cool. At the very, very end, when the landmark comes open, they walk down the street, and I thought, I have a feeling Venus would get a real kick out of this. That her brothers are like, and they're like, from the house of Xtravaganza, and they like name off her brothers. But her brothers go to this ball. Then her brother gets a tattoo of her name on him and talks about how he was being clean and sober for 22 years, and what got him sober was he was living in San Francisco, and he heard Venus's voice, and she was like, you're here for a deeper purpose. Then they get the tombstone redone, which I thought was super powerful. And then they have the landmark ceremony, which was where they had, if you watch it closely and you know a lot of like famous trans people, there was a lot of famous trans people at this, I'm looking up something really quick. Hold on a second. There were a lot of trans people at, famous trans people that were in this, not that it really matters, but I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, at this, I'm going to get back to my notes. At this landmark hearing, and I was just like, this is the coolest thing ever. Like, this is just so cool that all these people are out here. It was kind of like a really, really huge thing. And I wanted to share with you guys, I was looking it up, Dominique Jackson from the movie Pose, or the TV show Pose. So if you don't know Pose, it's a Ryan Murphy show, and Dominique Jackson plays a house mother in it. It's about the ballroom culture. It's basically kind of a little bit based on Paris is Burning a little bit, and some other documentaries have been done about the ballroom culture. But so much of it is, they say a lot of like the characters were like based on, I did this last year, so it would have been a year ago. They say so many of the characters were based on like actual members of the house community at that time. And so I love the show. My husband loves the show. So my husband's birthday was this weekend. A year ago, we were in Mexico. And at the last minute, I was like, I want to do something special for him. And I got him a few cameos. And one of the cameos I got was from Dominique, who we absolutely love. And here you can hear her right here.
Well, darling Alex, a very, very, very happy birthday to you, sweetheart. So, Peter asked me to do this and gave me instructions.
I would play it all for you, but it's like 3 minutes long. We sat there in our hotel room, and like all our friends stopped over afterwards, and it was just the coolest thing to see it. And to see her in this documentary, to see LGBTQI plus representation in documentaries, in movies, and books today, it didn't exist. It didn't exist to the 10 or 12-year-old Peter that was looking for it anywhere that I could find it. This documentary was phenomenal, and I loved it. I would highly recommend it to anybody. Let me know what you thought about it if you watched it in the comment section below. I love you guys, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.